Welcome back to Principles of Economics with Professor Klein at Cuesta College. Topic of today's video is business cycles. Now, when you hear the term business cycles, you might think that it's really about how businesses have an up and down in their revenue stream throughout the year. This is not what we mean when we think about business cycles from an economic perspective. When we think about business cycles from an economic perspective, we're really thinking about what happens to real GDP, again, because we're not concerned about the fact that there is inflation every year. That's a different topic to study, but that we're looking at real GDP across time, right? Now, across time, we expect economic growth, right? And so we plot this long-term growth trend. And so this long-term growth trend is just representing that over time, and particularly across generations, real GDP is going to increase. But in any particular year, real GDP may go down. And so when we draw this, we then tend to do a wave function, similar to something you might see in physics or in your math class. And similar to the wave function in those classes, we call the very top a peak and the very bottom a trough. There's where the similarities end. What we are particularly interested in economics is not are we hitting a peak, because we won't know that until after it's happened, but are we in a downward trajectory? And you may know that term, you've probably heard that, which we call a recession, right? What we often don't hear, but where we are often at in our economy, is in an expansion. And so when we talk about business cycles in economics, it's really the reference to real GDP going up and down in any particular year, even though we still expect that over time we are experiencing long-term growth, right? And so how can we think about 1% and 2% economic growth as this long-term growth trend? For that, we're going to look to the rule of 70 later in this unit. But the business cycle is just this idea that at any given year, we might have a recession. In any given year, we might be in an expansion, right? But that overall, we're still moving towards a larger real GDP. So I'm going to share my screen with you for this one. So here we're looking at our friend Fred, Federal Reserve economic data, and you'll see that this is real GDP, right? And so as we're looking at it, here's our billions of change, 2012 dollars, which tells us that it's real, right? Because if it tells us a year, it's telling us that that is the base year, right? So in this case, the base year, the prices that they're considering are 2012. And what we're seeing is that since 1950, right, in real terms, GDP has gone from roughly $2,000 to $18,000. And this is not thousands, this is billions of chain dollars. So when we say 2,000, it's 2,000 billion. So this is $2 trillion in 1945 and closer to $18 trillion in 2018. Now notice what has happened in the pandemic era. There's our steep drop off. You can't quite see it yet because as time goes by, there'll be more points to put on that graph, but it's a very steep drop off that's going on. And in fact, we can see that if we zoom in here. All right, so here we have from 2004. And so what do these shaded areas represent? These shaded areas represent the recessions, right? There's the business cycle. So this is what we're seeing in any particular given year. We experience an expansion. We experience GDP going up, right? Now, here we are back in 2020 when it dropped to $17 trillion, right? Where we were at close to 19 trillion before that. In fact, we were at 19.2 at the end of 2019, and now we're looking at a 17.2. So we lost $2 trillion as we had to shut down the economy due to a pandemic. Here's one more thing to think about, right, as we consider this graph and we consider business cycles. Why does it only go as far back as 1945? This actually is because this was a Nobel Prize winning idea, GDP. GDP and the idea that we could consider how much has been produced in a country and actually calculate that was an idea brought about by Simon Kuznets, one of the early economists, and that got him a Nobel Prize. And that is the system, though it has had modifications since it has been introduced. That's the system that we have used. Why 1945? Well, the whole idea came about because we were trying to figure out how much we could devote to the World War II effort. And in order to be able to do that, we had to have some way of figuring out how much we were able to produce in and of itself. And so then that became a very useful economic tool. And really, this is how we think about economic growth. And so you can see this massive economic growth that has happened since World War II. And this is just the United States, right? This is going to look different for every country. And so the business cycles, again, the key here is that the shaded areas represent the recessions and the other white areas are representing expansion. And notice there are many more periods of expansion than recessions. So how come we don't focus as much on expansions? Well, because that's where we want our economy to be, right? We want our economy to be growing. And so if it's growing at a steady pace, we feel like that's what our economy is supposed to be doing. So we spend most of our time trying to figure out why recessions occur, and particularly whether or not the government needs to do something additional to what it would normally do, right? Okay, so there you are. There's your illustration of what it actually looks like, the business cycle. Hope this was helpful. I'll see you next time.